I feel highly honored. Britain has always stood with Nigeria throughout its turbulent history, and all Nigerians really appreciate that.
In this edition of Back in History, we bring to you the graphic story of the sickness and death of President Umaru Musa Yar'Adua, who was Nigeria's civilian president from May 2007 to May 2010. We also bring to you the power struggle and intrigues that followed the sickness and death of the president, and the refusal to allow Vice President Goodluck Jonathan to see his boss despite all requests to that effect. Jonathan was only able to see his remains on the day the president passed on. Welcome to this edition of Back in History. Umaru Musa Yar'Adua was elected into office as Nigeria's president in 2007. He took the oath of office and allegiance in May of the said year. He was expected to be in office for 4 years, and by the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, he was entitled to run for a second term of 4 additional years, which would have enabled him to remain in office for a cumulative period of 8 years. Unknown to Nigerian citizens, Yar'Adua was not going to complete even the first term, let alone contest for a second term. Death was determined to strike before the end of his first tenure, but the date and time was not known until it struck on the 5th day of May 2010, barely 3 years into the administration of President Yar'Adua. The known history of Yar'Adua's sickness dates back to his time as governor of Katsina State. Yar'Adua served as governor of the said state from 1999 to 2007, a total of 8 years. During this time, Yar'Adua is reported to have taken ill along the way. The sickness was serious, and he had to be flown to Germany, where he was hospitalized and closely managed by a team of experts for 6 months. It is said that he underwent a kidney transplant during the 6-month stay in Germany. He, however, became well and returned to work in Katsina. He completed his tenure as governor, and there appeared to be no further cause for alarm about his health. In the build-up to the 2007 presidential election in Nigeria, and as President Olusegun Obasanjo was preparing to exit office, several persons, such as Donald Duke, Victor Atta, Peter Odili, and many others, declared interest in the #1 office in Nigeria. But for Obasanjo, the most preferred candidate for the top job was Umaru Musa Yar'Adua, whom Obasanjo described as a man of integrity and deep contentment. Obasanjo then rallied support for Umaru, who then emerged as the flag bearer of the ruling party at the time, the People's Democratic Party. Campaigns were conducted, followed with election. In the end, Umaru Musa Yar'Adua emerged as the winner of the presidential election. In the course of the campaigns, some persons were concerned about the health status of Umaru Yar'Adua and his ability to withstand the demands of the office of president. In one of the campaign grounds, Yar'Adua was absent, thereby fueling more suspicion about his health. President Olusegun Obasanjo was at the campaign ground and had to place a telephone call to Yar'Adua, who was on his hospital bed outside the country. The call was placed on speakers, and Yar'Adua responded by saying that he was doing fine. Several persons became skeptical at that moment and moving forward. The elections held, and Yar'Adua won. He was sworn in May 2007 with Dr. Goodluck Ebele Jonathan as his vice president. Goodluck Jonathan would later succeed Yar'Adua upon the unexpected demise of Yar'Adua in May 2010. The first known incident of Yar'Adua's health challenge at the Aso Rock Villa, the official residence of Nigeria's president, was in April 2008. Earlier in the month, the president started taking some malaria drugs that had been prescribed for him by his doctor for the treatment of malaria. A few days after, it was noticed that there was no improvement, for which reason another medication was prescribed for the president. This new prescription brought relief to the president, but had an allergic reaction on him. The president's face became visibly swollen. The situation became worse that the president had to visit the National Hospital, Abuja, where the chief medical director, Dr. Olusegun Ajuwon, attended to the president in his bid to tackle the situation. As at April 12, 2008, the president was in a very bad shape, as his face had swollen so badly and so visibly. Unfortunately, this was the date scheduled for the signing of the annual budget after months of foot dragging with the National Assembly. The press, with their cameras, had already been invited to be at the Aso Rock Villa by 10 a.m. for the budget signing formalities, yet the president's face was swollen and thus not good enough for the public cameras. The presidency was thus in a dilemma of how to handle the situation and avoid embarrassing pictures in the public space. The situation was however managed through, with government photographers only allowed to take shots, and the budget was signed, but it was clear that the president was in a serious health challenge which required urgent medical attention. Preparations were then made, and the president was then flown out to Germany for treatment. What followed was a public announcement from the office of the Chief Press Secretary to the President, Segun Adeniyi, who announced that, quote, "The budget has been signed by the President, and the President will leave for Wiesbaden, Germany to see his private physicians for a medical review of an indisposition believed to be due to an allergic reaction," unquote. This journey to Germany turned out to be a long journey, and later on, a journey of no return. President Yar'Adua arrived Germany with his personal aides. He was admitted into the hospital, and in few days, there was some improvement in his health. He stayed in the German hospital and was well enough in about 2 weeks to return to Nigeria to continue his work. He was received at the airport by a retinue of aides, state governors, and other officials. But one thing was certain: the president's health was in need of close monitoring, and his work schedule was going to be affected. The demands of the office of president, with long hours of meeting and long hours of work, may have triggered his health situation, yet he still had time to serve out his tenure as President and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Nigeria. Yar'Adua settled into office and went about his work without any further public concern. Not long after, precisely on August 20th, 2008, the President informed members of the Federal Executive Council that he would be traveling to Saudi Arabia later that day to perform the Lesser Hajj, the Umrah. He said he would leave the council chambers by lunchtime, and that when the members returned in the afternoon, the Vice President would be presiding. The President then departed the country for the said Lesser Hajj. The President was expected to return to the country in 4 days' time, precisely on 24th August 2008. Not many people had known at the time that the President was also scheduled for medicals in Saudi Arabia. As a matter of fact, there was no public announcement to that effect. Few days into his stay in Saudi Arabia, Sahara Reporters, an online news channel based in the United States of America but owned by a Nigerian citizen, Omoyele Sowore, broke the news to the world that the president was in Saudi Arabia for medicals and not for Umrah. The international media picked on the story and escalated it. Pressure was then mounted on the handlers of the presidency back home in Nigeria to make full disclosure of the status of the president's health, but the needed information was not forthcoming. Even within the presidency, some critical members of the presidency were not aware of what exactly was going on. It was also curious to them that even the chief physician to the president, Dr. Banye, was left out of the president's trip to Saudi Arabia, thus fueling serious suspicion as to the true state of the president's health. More so, as Sahara reporters had already exposed to the world that the president was not in Saudi Arabia for Umrah, but for medicals. Recall that the president was last treated in Germany. It was thus curious how and why the decision was taken to change from Germany to Saudi Arabia when his medical history was very much in Germany. It was later discovered that it was done on the belief that the American security agents had penetrated the hospital in Germany and had gained access to the president's medical record. Going to Saudi Arabia was therefore a move to protect such information. In the end, the change in hospital did not help in the ailing president's health condition. 7 days elapsed and the president was not back in Nigeria. On 27th August 2008, the Federal Executive Council was scheduled to hold, but the president was not available to preside. The Vice President, Dr. Goodluck Jonathan, then presided, but had no answers to questions about the president's health. The Vice President informed the EXCO members that he was unable to speak with the president, that whenever he called his phone, he only succeeded in speaking with his Chief Security Officer or ADC. What to tell the State House correspondents after the EXCO meeting was therefore a problem. But the then Minister of Information, John Ode, and then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ojoma Adueke, had their way around it and simply briefed the journalists that the president will soon return to the country. John Ode in particular said, and I quote, "To the best of my knowledge, the president is still performing the Lesser Hajj. I cannot say when he will return because Umrah is a personal prayer affair," unquote. Even John Ode did not believe in the statement he made, but he obviously needed to say something to the press. The trip to Saudi Arabia was shrouded in secrecy to the extent that even key ministers of government and the vice president were kept in absolute darkness. They could not say for sure what exactly was going on. Only the wife of the president, the chief security officer to the president, and the ADC to the president had direct access to him and knew much about the health situation. For 2 weeks, the president did not return to the country. Power was not transmitted to the vice president before his departure. There was thus a serious anxiety in the country and a gap in governance. On 2nd September 2008, a bit of refreshing news came that the president has spoken on phone for the first time with the Vice President Goodluck Jonathan, the Senate President David Mark, and the Speaker of the House of Reps, Dimeji Bankole. 17 days after he left Nigeria to Saudi Arabia, the president flew back to the country and resumed work. One of the first actions he took was to sack Ambassador Babagana Kingibe, who was secretary to the federal government of Nigeria. It was reported to him that Babagana was sabotaging his government during his absence by going around the country to have meetings with emirs down north to discuss possible change of power in the event that Yar'Adua was unable to return to office. As noted above, the president returned to work in his office as soon as he arrived from Saudi Arabia. After some time, he made arrangements to travel out of Abuja on vacation to Obudu Cattle Ranch in Cross River State. The press was notified of the president's vacation. The president, however, took ill in Aso Rock and could not travel out of Abuja to Obudu. The president would spend the next 2 weeks in Aso Rock Villa receiving treatment without going to work. This again fueled serious suspicions about the health status of the president. What he was treated for was never made public. The president eventually became well and resumed work, but by this time, it was clear that his strength had greatly reduced and the president could barely work for 5 hours in a day. He was driven to the office from his home, despite the short distance. There were also days when he could not go to the office. There was no doubt that his health was having a negative impact on governance in the country. Meetings were frequently cancelled and crucial decisions could not be taken, as ministers and heads of government agencies and parastatals could not secure the president's approval to proceed on several issues. On July 20th, 2009, President Yar'Adua was in Togo to attend the ECOWAS summit at the request of President Faure Iyadema. In line with established protocols, Yar'Adua, as visiting president, was expected to inspect a guard of honor upon his arrival in Togo. It is reported that no one anticipated any trouble until the president took about 20 steps and could not move again. The president then whispered to his ADC, Colonel Mustapha Dennis Onoyiveta, an Roboman from Delta State, who quickly gave him cover and assisted him to a room at the arrival hall. The Togolese president immediately offered every needed assistance to the Nigerian president and had great pity for his guest. The event of this day sounded a further note that the president's health was worsening seriously and that the president needed to travel out to attend to his health. On Friday, August 14, 2009, Nigerians were informed that the president would be traveling out of the country for a scheduled medical checkup and is expected to return to the country in 1 week. He traveled out as was announced and returned to the country in exactly 1 week and then went back to work. He looked better, but in no time his health collapsed again. He was hurriedly flown to Saudi Arabia for treatment. On Monday 23rd November 2009, his chief press secretary Olusegun Adeniyi made the following press release, quote, President Umaru Musa Yar'Adua left Abuja today for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. While there, the president will call on his personal physicians in Jeddah for follow-up medical checks. End of quote. This was the president's third medical trip in 2 months, and the outcry in Nigeria was exceedingly loud. At this time, the president had been diagnosed with acute pericarditis, an inflammatory condition of the obstruction and coverings of the heart. President Yar'Adua spent several days rolling into weeks in the hospital, and the country was thrown into confusion, more so as the president did not transmit power to Dr. Jonathan, as was required of him by the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. There were calls for the president to transmit power to the vice president, even from his hospital bed in Saudi Arabia. But it appears that the handlers of the president blocked him from making the transmission of power. While the president remained in Saudi Arabia, the tenure of the Chief Justice of Nigeria elapsed, and there was serious concern about who was going to swear in the next Chief Justice. The outgoing Chief Justice, Justice Idris Kutigi, took the decision to swear in his successor, Justice Katsina Allo. This was unprecedented in the history of Nigeria, and the outcry that followed this action was really loud But the outgoing Chief Justice of Nigeria defended his action as having the backing of the law, particularly the Oath Act, which allows the incumbent to swear in his successor. Also during this time, the supplementary budget was ready for signing, but the president was away in the hospital at Saudi Arabia. The budget had to be taken to Saudi Arabia by the president's principal secretary for the president's signature. He left the country in one of the jets in the presidential fleet on 26 December 2009 and arrived at Jeddah. He was later driven to King Faisal Hospital, where he met with the president's physician and the chief security officer, who told him that the president was asleep and that when he wakes up, he will be invited to meet with him. The principal secretary stayed for several days in Saudi Arabia but could not see the president. He was then asked to drop the documents for the president to sign at his convenience. He later returned the following day to pick up the document. He did not witness the signing of the document by the president and thus could not vouch about who exactly signed the document. He nonetheless came back with the budget on 29th December 2009. The president's stay in the hospital was getting too long, and the calls at home for him to urgently transmit power to the vice president was becoming really loud. The country was at this point without a constitutionally recognized leader. As of January of the new year 2010, the president was still not back in the country. Worse still, his Attorney General, Michael Andoka, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, in his legal opinion, had opined that the president could rule Nigeria from anywhere in the world, a statement which was greeted with outcry and total condemnation. On 29th January 2010, General Yakubu Gowon, Alhaji Shehu Shagari, and Ernest Shenekon, all past presidents of Nigeria, joined in the call for Yar'Adua to transmit power to the vice president. Many other persons also made the same call to no avail. Professor Dora Akunyele, then Minister of Information, also made a similar call and lamented the fact that, even as Minister of Information, she was kept in total darkness about the state of health of the president. At this time, the president had been away for about 70 days. The situation became very critical that something urgent needed to be done. There was rumor that the president had died in Saudi Arabia and that his body was being hidden away. To douse this story, the handlers of the president then invited the BBC Hausa service to visit Saudi Arabia and interview the president as evidence that the president was still alive. The interview was conducted and was broadcast on BBC. In it, the president stated that he was not dead as reported, but that he was only sick but hopeful of recovery. Even from the president's voice, it was clear that all was not well and that something urgently needed to be done. It was at this point that the then Senate President David Mark held meetings with his colleagues and principal officers of the National Assembly and the Chief Justice of Nigeria, and a decision was taken to apply the doctrine of necessity to give authority for the Vice President to act as the acting President of Nigeria, pending the return of the President. This was the first time that this doctrine was to be implemented in the history of Nigeria. Jonathan then began to pilot the affairs of the country as acting president. Soon after Jonathan was given the power to act as acting president, the handlers of President Yar'Adua hurriedly returned him to Nigeria from Saudi Arabia. It is reported that Yar'Adua's health condition at this time did not improve at all. It was therefore ill-advised for the president to be hurriedly flown back to the villa. Obviously, his handlers prevailed on the hospital to discharge him at all costs and rather continue the treatment at home in Aso Rock Villa, perhaps in the bid to secure Yar'Adua's presidency from being taken away. This decision would in no time turn out to be a disastrous decision which ought not to have been taken in the first place. The decision by the handlers of the president to return him to Nigeria also included the decision to return him at night so as to hide him from public view. All plans were perfected, and indeed the president's jet touched down at the airport in Abuja in the cover of darkness. Unknown to the handlers, several international media houses were closely following the story of the president's health, and some of them had sent their correspondents to Saudi Arabia to secretly keep close monitoring of the situation. It appears that they also got information from some of the president's handlers or from someone in the hospital that the president was going back to Nigeria. So the plan to hurriedly return the president at night was leaked, which the journalists from the said media houses communicated with their correspondent in Nigeria to immediately mobilize cameras and wait at the airport in Abuja to capture the president's arrival. In particular, the CNN had hidden a camera in the nearby bush to capture the president's arrival without missing the critical point. At about 1:45 a.m., a time when most Nigerians were still asleep, a chartered air ambulance and the presidential jet arrived at the Abuja International Airport. The camera hidden nearby by the CNN captured the arrival and relayed it live on CNN. And persons that were awake at the time could watch the episode live in their homes. Nothing would have been more embarrassing to the handlers of the president, who touched down in the country believing that no one was awake at the time to know what was going on. They never knew that their plan had leaked, and badly at that. One of the aircraft was made to stop in the middle of the tarmac, while an ambulance was driven to the plane to evacuate the president. The president was then driven to his residence at the presidential villa, where he was hidden away from several persons for many days, rolling into weeks. Even the acting president, Goodluck Jonathan, was not allowed to see Yar'Adua on his sickbed in Aso Rock. The Senate president was not allowed, neither was the speaker. No minister of the government was allowed to see the president. Only Yar'Adua's wife Toure and close aides like the ADC and TSO were able to see the president. The president's health became worse by the day, with no recovery in sight. The country boiled in arguments and calls for the president to resign. The country became deeply polarized on religious and political lines. There was indeed a serious problem at hand. Later on, following continued outcry, some Islamic clerics were allowed to go in and see the president. Later again, some Christian clerics were also allowed to see the president. These included the following persons: Pastor E.E. Adeboye, Most Reverend John Onaikon, Bishop David Oyedepo, and Reverend Emmanuel Kure. They offered prayers for the president and saw to themselves with great pity that except there was a miracle, President Umaru Musa Yar'Adua was sadly in his last days. On 5th May 2010, the president gave up the ghost at his residence in Aso Rock Villa. He died at about 8:40 p.m. The chief security officer and the ADC to the deceased president then went to the residence of the acting president, Goodluck Jonathan, and informed him of the president's demise. Jonathan then called up the Speaker, Deputy Senate President, Secretary to the Federal Government, National Security Advisor, and his Principal Secretary to accompany him to the President's residence. They met with the president's wife and then went upstairs to see the remains of the president. That was the first time that Jonathan would see his boss in many months. On May 6, 2010, the president's body was wheeled out into an ambulance and from there was taken to the airport and flown to his hometown in Katsina State. This brought to an end the life and time of a man who rose to become the president of his country, but whom the cold hands of death did not allow him complete his tenure. In his book titled Power, Politics and Death, and published in 2010, Olusegun Adeniyi, who was President Yar'Adua's chief press secretary and who watched the last days of Yar'Adua's presidency closely, had this to say at the last page of the book, unquote, "The death of President Yar'Adua brought a dramatic end to the saga in the country. Yet, notwithstanding the bad blood generated by his last weeks in office, there was a national and indeed a global consensus that Yar'Adua was a decent man who gave his best to his country despite his health challenges." End of quote. President Yar'Adua was born on 16th August 1951. He hailed from Katsina State. He served as governor of his state from 1999 to 2007, and from 2007 to 2010, he was the president of Nigeria. He was only 58 years old at the time of his death. He left behind 9 children, a wife, and an aged mother who is still alive at the time of the making of this video. Many thanks for watching this edition of Back in History, and do remember to subscribe to the channel for regular notifications.